The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window of the small ranch house in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum. Sarah Chen sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. She wasn't looking at the coffee, though. She was staring at the framed photograph next to it, her daughter in full military dress, standing proud in front of an American flag. Lieutenant Rebecca Chen had been missing in action for 14 days. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for the envelope that sat unopened on the table. The official seal on the front made her stomach turn. She recognized it immediately. Her husband, Michael, sat across from her, his face a mask of careful neutralness. They had both learned that expression over the past 2 weeks, the face you wear when you're trying not to fall apart completely. The envelope was from the Department of Defense. "Do you want me to open it?" Michael asked quietly. His voice had taken on that thin, reedy quality it always got when he was terrified. Sarah had heard that voice before, but never quite like this. She shook her head slowly. She didn't want it opened. If she didn't open it, maybe the words inside wouldn't be real. Maybe they could stay in this moment where Rebecca was just missing, not confirmed, not gone. But she knew better. After 14 days, there was only one reason they would send an official letter. With shaking fingers, Sarah tore open the envelope. The words blurred in front of her eyes. She read them once, then again, then a third time as if reading them differently might change their meaning. "Killed in action," she whispered. The words hung in the kitchen air like a curse. Michael reached across the table and took her hand, but she couldn't feel it. Her whole body had gone numb, the way it does when you receive information so terrible that your mind simply refuses to accept it. Rebecca had been a soldier for 5 years. She had served 2 previous tours in the Middle East without incident. She was careful, methodical, and trained to the highest standard. She was also the strongest person Sarah had ever known, physically and mentally. She was the kind of woman who could endure anything. But endurance couldn't stop a bullet. The funeral was held 3 weeks later on a cold November day. The entire town of Millbrook seemed to turn out. Rebecca had grown up here, gone to Millbrook High School, graduated with honors. Everyone knew her. Everyone knew her story. Sarah sat in the front pew of St. Michael's Catholic Church, wearing a black dress that felt like a funeral shroud wrapped around her own body. She wasn't sure if she was alive or dead herself anymore. The priest's words floated past her ears without meaning. She stared at the American flag draped over the wooden casket. There was no body in that casket. Rebecca had been identified through DNA evidence found at the site of the ambush. That was what the official report said. An ambush in a small village 70 kilometers from their forward operating base. 3 soldiers killed. Rebecca was one of them. Around her, she could see the townspeople crying. She recognized Mrs. Patterson from next door, who had watched Rebecca grow up. There was Coach Morrison, who had taught her high school PE and always said Rebecca had the discipline and determination of an Olympic athlete. There was Father Michael himself, who had baptized Rebecca as a baby. But there was also something else. Behind the sympathy in their eyes, Sarah could see a kind of judgment. She could see it in the way some of the older men from town whispered to each other. She could see it in the set of some of the mothers' jaws as they looked at Sarah's face. She had seen that same judgment before, right after Rebecca had joined the military. The questions that were never asked directly but hung in the air nonetheless. Why would a young woman choose such a dangerous path? Why would she risk her life for a country that still had so much prejudice against women in combat roles? Why would she want to be a soldier when she could have been anything else? After the funeral, as people filed past to offer condolences, Sarah heard the whispers more clearly. "Such a waste," one woman said. "If she had just stayed home and had a family," another offered, as if that would have been a better way to spend her daughter's life. "These women soldiers aren't really cut out for combat," an older man said to Michael. "They don't have the physical capacity. I heard there were men on her team. Where were they when she needed protection?" The implication was clear and cruel. Rebecca's death was somehow a result of her being a woman trying to do a man's job, as if her competence and training counted for nothing against the simple fact of her gender. Sarah wanted to scream at all of them. She wanted to tell them that Rebecca was the most capable person she had ever met, that she had seen her daughter's medical records showing she had passed every physical test with flying colors, that Rebecca had been recommended for promotion twice in her short career. But Sarah said nothing. She simply accepted their sympathy and let them file past, each one offering their hollow words before moving on with their lives. The town would mourn Rebecca for a while, and then they would forget. Life would go on. Sarah's life, however, would never go on. It had ended in the moment she received that letter. She spent the next weeks in a fog of grief and pain. Michael tried to be supportive, bringing her tea, sitting with her in the darkness of their bedroom, but there was nothing he could do. No comfort existed that could touch this wound. Then, 1 month after the funeral, while Sarah was sorting through some of Rebecca's old things that had been shipped back from her military quarters, she found something that made her blood run cold. It was a journal hidden at the bottom of a box of letters and photographs. Sarah had never seen it before. Rebecca had always been private, but this journal seemed especially hidden. The cover was worn leather, and inside the handwriting was unmistakably her daughter's. The final entry was dated 3 days before Rebecca was reported killed in action. Sarah's hands shook so badly she could barely hold the journal steady. The handwriting on the pages was Rebecca's, neat, precise, the same handwriting that had filled out countless reports and emails over the years. But the words themselves painted a picture that contradicted everything the official report had said. The entry began simply enough. November 3rd, 3 days before we're supposed to rotate out. I can't believe I'll be home for Thanksgiving. But as Sarah read further, her heart began to race. Rebecca was writing about something that troubled her deeply. Something about the unit's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Derek Simmons. The supply discrepancies are getting worse, Rebecca had written. I found another shipment that went missing, medical supplies destined for the village clinic. Where is it going? And why does Carl Simmons get so angry when anyone asks questions? Sarah turned the page. The next entry was from 2 days before Rebecca's death. I confronted the colonel today about the supplies. I shouldn't have done it alone, but I was angry. I asked him directly where the shipment went. He told me I was out of line, questioning his authority. But then he said something else. He said if I didn't forget I ever saw anything, there would be consequences. He said my next patrol might be very dangerous. He said he couldn't be responsible for my safety if I was going to be a problem. Sarah's chest tightened. She read the words again, sure she must be misunderstanding them, but the meaning was clear. The next entry was dated the day before the ambush. I reported the conversation to my immediate superior, Sergeant James Walters. I told him what the colonel said to me. James got very quiet and told me I needed to be careful. He said that Colonel Simmons was well-connected, that he had friends in high places, and that there had been accidents before that involved soldiers who asked too many questions. He told me not to go on tomorrow's patrol. He told me to call in sick. But I can't do that. I won't do that. If I back down now, then what? He wins. The corruption continues. Soldiers keep dying because of his schemes. I'm going on the patrol tomorrow. I'm going to be careful, but I'm going. And I'm going to survive it, and then I'm going to report everything to the Army Inspector General. The final entry was barely a paragraph. November 6th. Patrol is in 6 hours. I'm scared, but not about the enemy. I'm scared about what I know. I'm scared about what happens next. But I know it's the right thing to do. Wish me luck. Sarah closed the journal and sat in absolute silence for nearly 5 minutes. Her mind was reeling, trying to process what she had just read. It didn't make sense with the official report. According to the Army, Rebecca had been killed by enemy combatants during a routine patrol. It had been listed as an unfortunate casualty of war. But what if it wasn't an ambush at all? What if something else had happened? Sarah did something she had not done since receiving the news of Rebecca's death. She got out of bed. She went downstairs. She turned on her computer and she started researching. It took 3 hours of searching through military databases, news archives, and social media posts from soldiers who had served with Rebecca to find it. A Reddit thread from an anonymous account, posted 3 weeks after Rebecca's death. The post was from someone claiming to have been on Rebecca's base. I heard from someone I trust that the patrol went bad because command messed up, the post read. There was a leak about the route. Someone on the inside told the enemy where we'd be. 3 soldiers died. A girl named Rebecca was one of them. It shouldn't have happened. She was the best soldier we had, and she died because of someone's mistake. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake. Maybe it was on purpose. The post had been deleted, but someone had captured screenshots. Sarah found them in a forum dedicated to military accountability. She stared at the words on her screen, her heart pounding. This was speculation, rumor, the kind of thing that could be dismissed easily. But combined with Rebecca's journal entries, it took on a different weight. It seemed to suggest something darker than a simple combat casualty. Sarah picked up the phone and called the one person she knew might be able to help, Sergeant James Walters, Rebecca's immediate superior, the man who had told her to stay home from that final patrol. It took her 2 hours to track down his current contact information. After leaving the military, he had moved to Colorado and opened a small repair shop. When he answered the phone, his voice was cautious, careful. "Mrs. Chen?" he asked, as if he couldn't quite believe she was calling him. "Yes, I'm sorry to contact you out of the blue, Sergeant Walters. I found Rebecca's journal. I read what she wrote about Colonel Simmons. I need to know what really happened on that last patrol." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. She could hear him breathing, could sense him weighing his options. "Mrs. Chen, I can't talk about this over the phone," he finally said. "But I will tell you this, your daughter was brave. She was right about Simmons. And yes, there were questions about that patrol, questions that were never properly investigated, questions that went away after her death." "Why?" Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Because," Walters said quietly, "the people with the power to investigate had reasons not to. And Rebecca was just one soldier, one woman. It was easier to forget than to pursue the truth." After the call ended, Sarah sat at her computer in the darkness of her house, the journal on her lap, and made a decision. Everyone had told her that Rebecca was gone, that she should accept this loss and move on with her life. But what if Rebecca hadn't died the way they said she did? What if there was a story here that needed to be told? What if Rebecca's death could actually mean something? Sarah had spent most of her life being quiet and following the rules. But she was Rebecca's mother, and Rebecca had been brave enough to stand up for what was right, even when it could have gotten her killed. The next month was the hardest of Sarah's life. She didn't have the training that Rebecca had, didn't have the military connections or the resources. What she had was a mother's determination and a journal full of evidence. She started by reaching out to military journalists. Most of them ignored her initial emails, but one woman, Nina Rodriguez, a reporter who had spent years covering military corruption, agreed to meet with her. They met at a small coffee shop about an hour from Millbrook. Nina was younger than Sarah had expected, probably in her late 30s, with sharp eyes and a notebook filled with observations. She read through Rebecca's journal carefully, making notes, her expression growing more serious with each page. "This is significant," Nina said finally. "But it's not enough on its own. A journal is one person's account. We'd need corroboration. We'd need other witnesses." "There must be other soldiers who know what happened," Sarah said. "Other people who saw the corruption Simmons was involved in." "Possibly," Nina agreed. "But soldiers are trained to follow the chain of command. Speaking out, especially against an officer, could end careers. It could cause problems for people who are still in the military." "My daughter spoke out," Sarah said quietly, "and she died." Nina leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah carefully. "Do you believe that Colonel Simmons was directly responsible for your daughter's death?" Sarah had asked herself this question 100 times in the past month. The truth was more complicated than simple murder, but it was also more complicated than a random combat death. "I believe," Sarah said carefully, "that he put her on a patrol he knew was dangerous. I believe he made a threat to her beforehand. And I believe that when she died, he had reasons to make sure the investigation didn't dig too deep." Nina nodded slowly. "That's harder to prove than a direct order to kill someone, but it's possible. Let me see what I can dig up. I have some contacts who have worked with soldiers from that base. Give me 2 weeks." 2 weeks turned into 2 months. Sarah spent the time reaching out to other families of soldiers who had been stationed at the same base where Rebecca had died. She attended support groups for military families who had lost loved ones. She filled boxes with documents, copies of Rebecca's journal, military records she had obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, emails from other soldiers who had been willing to talk to her anonymously. The picture that emerged was damning. Colonel Derek Simmons had been engaged in what appeared to be a significant black market operation, selling military supplies and equipment that had been marked for distribution to local villages and humanitarian purposes. The supplies were worth tens of thousands of dollars. More importantly, the missing supplies meant that people in those villages, people who depended on American medical aid and support, had been left without the resources they needed. But proving it was another matter. Simmons had covered his tracks carefully. The official records showed everything as accounted for. Any discrepancies had been attributed to clerical errors or supply losses to enemy action. Then, 3 months after Sarah first read Rebecca's journal, Nina called with news. "I found someone willing to testify," she said. "His name is Major Thomas Hart. He was stationed at the same base in the supply division. He saw the transactions firsthand. He was afraid to come forward while he was still active duty, but he just retired. He's willing to talk." Major Hart turned out to be a man of about 60, with gray at his temples and the bearing of a lifetime military officer. He met with Sarah, Nina, and a lawyer who had been recommended by one of the military families Sarah had connected with. He was nervous, clearly uncomfortable with what he was doing, but he was also determined. "I reported it," he said. 3 separate times I reported it to my superiors. I made it clear what was happening, and each time I was told to mind my own business. The 3rd time I was threatened with transfer and demotion if I mentioned it again." "Why didn't you go to the Inspector General?" the lawyer asked. "Because," Hart said heavily, "I had a family. I had a retirement to think about, and I told myself that someone else would handle it, someone braver than me." His eyes met Sarah's. She could see the regret there, the weight of decisions not made, the burden of silence. "Your daughter was braver than me," he said. "I should have done what she did. I should have reported it officially and let the chips fall where they might, but I was afraid. And now she's dead, and Simmons is still out there, still in a position of authority." With Hart's testimony, things began to move. Nina published a preliminary report in an online military journal. The story began to spread, picked up by larger news outlets. The Army was forced to open an investigation. Within 2 weeks, Colonel Simmons was suspended from his position pending a full inquiry. But then something strange happened. The investigation seemed to stall. Witnesses who had agreed to speak became suddenly unavailable. Documents that Hart had identified as evidence went missing from the official records. It became clear that someone, or possibly a group of someones, didn't want this investigation to succeed. Sarah was sitting in her kitchen one evening, reading through the latest news reports when her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, but she answered it anyway. "Mrs. Chen," the voice was male, older, authoritative. "My name is General Richard Morrison. I'm calling about your daughter's case." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. General Morrison was one of the highest-ranking officers in the Army. He had tremendous influence and power. "I wanted to speak with you directly," he continued, "about the investigation into Colonel Simmons. There are complexities you may not be aware of. National security matters that can't be made public. I think it would be best if we allowed the matter to be handled quietly without further media involvement." "Quietly," Sarah repeated. "My daughter is dead. The people responsible need to be held accountable." "Your daughter died in combat," General Morrison said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "That's the official finding, and that's how it will remain. If you continue pushing this narrative, there will be consequences. Not for you, perhaps, but there are other soldiers at that base. There are other families who might be damaged by continued investigation into internal military matters." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. This was a threat, thinly veiled but unmistakable. "General Morrison," she said, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. "My daughter reported a crime. She tried to do the right thing and she died. I won't stop looking for the truth." The call from General Morrison was a turning point, though not in the way he had intended. It confirmed what Sarah had begun to suspect, that the corruption went deeper than one colonel, that there were people in positions of real power who had a vested interest in keeping this quiet. Sarah called Nina immediately and told her about the call. The reporter's response was sharp and immediate. "He called to intimidate you," Nina said. "That's a significant development. That suggests panic from people in high places. If this was just about one corrupt officer, they wouldn't be making direct calls to civilians." What followed over the next 3 months was a difficult period of escalation. Someone, Sarah never found out who, began making her life increasingly difficult. The local police showed up at her house twice after anonymous calls claiming she was a danger to herself. Both times, the visits were courtesy but firm. They wanted to know if she was handling her grief well. They wanted to know if she was taking any medications that might affect her mental state. It was harassment disguised as concern, a subtle but effective way of trying to discredit her before she could be a real problem. She also noticed her credit reports were being checked repeatedly by people she didn't recognize. Her email accounts were hacked twice, and she recovered only after changing all her passwords. Someone left a dead crow on her front porch. The local newspaper published a harsh opinion piece questioning whether Sarah was using her daughter's memory as a way to get attention and create conspiracy theories. Michael wanted her to stop. He was frightened, and she could see the toll it was taking on him. "Please," he begged her one evening. "Please just let this go. Let's try to move forward. Let's try to remember Rebecca the way we want to remember her without all this pain." It was a reasonable request. It was probably the smart thing to do. But Sarah had learned something from her daughter's death that she had never known before. Sometimes, the right thing to do was not the same as the safe thing to do. "I can't," she told Michael. "Rebecca couldn't either, and it got her killed." Michael didn't leave, but something between them grew distant. He loved her, but he also couldn't support what she was doing. And Sarah understood that, even as it broke her heart a little more. But she was not alone in her fight. Other families were joining her. Wives and parents and siblings of soldiers who had died at the same base, or at other bases where similar corruption had been alleged. They formed an informal network, sharing information, supporting each other through the intimidation and the obstacles. And then in late March, Sergeant James Walters reached out to Sarah again. He wanted to do a full interview with Nina on the record about what he had witnessed and the threats he had received. It was a significant escalation for him. It meant potentially facing legal action, career consequences, possible retaliation. "I've been thinking about what your daughter did," he told Sarah when they spoke on the phone about his decision. "I've been thinking about the fact that she was brave enough to die for the truth. It seems like the least I can do is live for it." With Walter's on-the-record testimony, the story took on new weight. Major Hart agreed to appear on camera as well. Other soldiers, younger ones who had more to lose, began to come forward anonymously through secure channels, providing documents and evidence. Nina compiled everything into a comprehensive investigative report that ran as a multi-part series in a major national news outlet. The evidence was damning and difficult to refute. It showed a clear pattern of corruption involving multiple officers, extending back several years. It showed how reports of the corruption had been suppressed and how officers who tried to bring attention to it had been discouraged, threatened, or transferred. And it showed, clearly and with multiple corroborating sources, that Rebecca Chen had been killed by an enemy ambush on a patrol route that she had reported was being leaked to enemy forces. Whether that leak was deliberately provided to target Rebecca specifically, or whether it was simply a consequence of the chaotic corruption within her unit, remained unclear. But what was clear was that Rebecca had known the patrol was dangerous and had gone anyway, because she had believed it was her duty. The story went viral. Within days, it was picked up by news organizations around the world. Calls began coming into congressional offices, demanding an investigation. The Secretary of Defense made a public statement promising a full inquiry. 3 colonels and 2 generals were placed on administrative leave. The military trial of Colonel Derek Simmons began on a rainy Tuesday in June. Sarah sat in the courtroom gallery, along with dozens of other people, journalists, military observers, family members of soldiers who had been affected by the corruption. Michael sat next to her, holding her hand. They hadn't spoken more than a few words to each other in weeks, but her need to be here had drawn him back. He understood that much, even if he couldn't support the path that had led here. Simmons looked smaller than Sarah had expected. She had built him up in her mind as this monolithic figure of power and evil. In reality, he was just a man in his late 50s, with thinning hair and a face that seemed to have aged 10 years in the past 6 months. The prosecution's case was straightforward and comprehensive. They presented evidence of the supply theft, the black market sales, the falsified records. They presented Major Hart and Sergeant Walters, who testified about the cover-ups and the intimidation. They presented the leaked reports that showed the patrol route had been compromised. And then they presented Rebecca's journal. The prosecutor read from it in open court, sharing Rebecca's words with the world. There was a moment where Sarah felt her chest constrict so tightly she couldn't breathe. Her daughter's voice, in written form, speaking from beyond the grave about the threats she had received, the corruption she had witnessed, the dangers she had chosen to face anyway. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. The defense attempted to argue that Simmons could not be held responsible for Rebecca's death, that her death was a result of enemy action and not military misconduct. But the evidence showed that Simmons' own negligence and corruption had contributed to the conditions that led to her death. More importantly, it showed that he had deliberately threatened a subordinate and then allowed that subordinate to be placed in danger, which constituted criminal conduct regardless of the final outcome. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The verdict came back on a Thursday morning. Colonel Derek Simmons was convicted of corruption, fraud, bribery, obstruction of justice, and involuntary manslaughter. The judge sentenced him to 20 years in federal prison. He was stripped of his rank and his military pension was revoked. As the verdict was read, Sarah felt something inside her shift. Not relief exactly. Rebecca was still dead and nothing could change that, but justice, a form of justice. A recognition that Rebecca's death had not been meaningless, that her words and her courage had mattered, that the truth had prevailed. Simmons' face, as he was led out of the courtroom, showed no expression. He had lived a military career believing that power protected him, that his rank and his connections would shield him from consequences. He had never expected to be held accountable. The shock of it seemed to have broken something in him. But the victory was not complete. 2 generals were investigated and ultimately allowed to resign with honors rather than face trial. Several other officers who had been complicit in the cover-up received minor reprimands and were transferred to different bases. The system, it seemed, had ways of protecting its own. Still, Sarah felt Rebecca's presence in the courtroom as the verdict was read. She felt it in the applause that broke out from the gallery when Simmons was taken away. She felt it in the way soldiers and former soldiers in the courtroom stood in respect, a silent acknowledgement of what Rebecca had sacrificed. After the trial, Sarah gave her first public interview. She sat with Nina Rodriguez in a studio, and she talked about Rebecca. She talked about the daughter she had lost, about the remarkable young woman who had chosen to stand up for what was right even when it meant putting herself in danger. She was just 28 years old, Sarah said, looking directly at the camera. She had her whole life ahead of her. She could have ignored the corruption. She could have kept her head down and done her job and gotten out of the military safely. But that wasn't who she was. She believed that the truth mattered more than safety, that doing the right thing mattered more than self-preservation. If she had never confronted Colonel Simmons, she might still be alive today, the interviewer said gently. That's possible, Sarah acknowledged. But she wouldn't be the person I knew her to be. She would have compromised her integrity. And in the end, I think she would have been dead inside in a way that would have been worse than anything that could have happened to her. The interview aired on a Sunday evening and was watched by more than 2 million people. Messages poured in from people around the country, from soldiers, from parents, from young women who said they had decided to enlist because of Rebecca's story, from people who said they had been inspired by her courage to speak up about injustices in their own lives. But the moment that affected Sarah most came 3 weeks after the interview. She received a letter from another soldier who had been stationed at the same base as Rebecca. This soldier identified herself only as Lee in the letter. She wrote about having witnessed Simmons' abuse and corruption, but having been too afraid to come forward. She wrote about how reading about Rebecca's bravery had given her the courage to finally speak to a counselor about her experiences. "Your daughter changed my life," Lee wrote. "She made me believe that I had the strength to stand up for myself and for others. Even though she's gone, she's still making a difference." Sarah read this letter so many times that the paper became worn and creased. She showed it to Michael, and she saw him crying for the first time since Rebecca's death. They held each other in their kitchen, allowing themselves to grieve together for the daughter they had lost and the woman she had been. 1 year after Colonel Simmons' conviction, Sarah received an invitation to speak at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. The subject was military ethics and integrity, and they wanted her to talk about Rebecca's story. Sarah had never given a speech before. She was terrified, but she was also certain that this was what Rebecca would have wanted, for her story to be used to inspire young soldiers to maintain their integrity, to speak out against injustice, to understand that their individual choices mattered. Michael drove her to New York for the event. They made a weekend of it, something they hadn't done together in a long time. As they drove, they talked, really talked for the first time in many months. They talked about their grief, about their different ways of processing loss, about how proud they both were of their daughter. "I'm sorry I couldn't support you the way you needed me to," Michael said at one point, his eyes on the road. "I know," Sarah replied, "but you're here now, that's what matters." The auditorium at West Point was packed. More than 1,000 cadets filled the seats, young men and women who were at the beginning of their military careers. They were the future officers of the United States Army. They were the ones who would be in positions of power and authority someday. Sarah walked to the podium and looked out at all those young faces. She was nervous, but she also felt Rebecca's presence with her, steadying her. She told Rebecca's story. She told them about the young woman who had been brave enough to stand alone, who had reported corruption even when she was warned it might cost her her life. She told them about the letter Rebecca had written about going on that final patrol, about knowing it might be dangerous, but believing it was the right thing to do anyway. She talked about the official story of Rebecca's death, and she talked about what actually happened. She talked about the corruption and the cover-ups, and the way the system had tried to protect itself by silencing her daughter's truth. But mostly, she talked about what Rebecca's life and death meant. Your daughter, your sister, your friend, Sarah said, will tell you that following orders is important, and it is. But your conscience is more important, your integrity is more important. Your country is more important than any individual officer or any individual career. My daughter knew that when she was 28 years old. She died knowing it. And what I want you to understand is that she didn't die for nothing. She died for a principle. She died for the idea that soldiers should serve their country honestly and that corruption and abuse of power will eventually be exposed and punished. When you take your oath as an officer, you will promise to support and defend the Constitution. You will not promise to support your commanding officer if they are acting illegally. You will not promise to protect the reputation of the military at the expense of the truth. You will promise to defend the Constitution. My daughter understood that, and I hope you will too. The auditorium erupted in applause. Sarah stood at the podium, her hands shaking, tears running down her face. She could feel her daughter in that moment. She felt as if Rebecca was proud of her, proud that her mother had found the strength to keep fighting, to keep pushing for truth and justice. After the speech, Sarah was surrounded by cadets, many of them crying, many of them asking to shake her hand or take a photograph with her. One young woman in particular caught her attention, a junior cadet named Jessica Martinez, with dark hair and intense eyes. My name is Jessica, she said, and I just want to tell you that I was thinking about leaving the military. I was going to resign. I had complaints about my commanding officer, and I knew no one would listen, so I was just going to quit and go home. But your speech changed my mind. Your daughter's story changed my mind. I'm going to report what I know. I'm going to trust that the system will work if people like me refuse to let it not work. Sarah embraced this young woman, this stranger, and felt something loosen in her chest. This was what Rebecca's death could become, not meaningless loss, but a catalyst for change, not an ending, but a beginning. Over the following months, Sarah learned that Jessica's report had led to an investigation of her commanding officer, which had revealed a pattern of sexual harassment and misconduct. The officer was discharged from the military. 12 other soldiers came forward with similar reports. And slowly, gradually, change began to ripple out from Rebecca's story. Military academies began emphasizing ethics training more heavily. The Inspector General's office received more reports of corruption and misconduct, and many of them were followed up on rather than dismissed. Young officers began to understand that speaking up was not disloyalty, but the highest form of loyalty to their country. 2 years after Rebecca's death, the Army established the Rebecca Chen Award for Integrity in Military Service. The award was given each year to a soldier, officer, or civilian who had demonstrated exceptional courage in reporting misconduct or corrupt practices, even when doing so put them at personal risk. Sarah was asked to present the award. She stood at the podium at the annual military awards ceremony, holding a plaque with her daughter's name on it. The first recipient was Major Thomas Hart, who had come forward about Simmons' crimes. He wept as he received the award, saying it was the greatest honor of his career. After the ceremony, Sarah sat in the quiet green room backstage, the award plaque still in her hands. She looked at Rebecca's photograph on the plaque and thought about everything that had happened since finding that journal. She thought about the cost of seeking justice, the fear, the intimidation, the time, the emotional toll. But she also thought about Jessica Martinez and the soldiers she had helped. She thought about Major Hart and Sergeant Walters, who had finally found the courage to speak the truth. She thought about all the young cadets at West Point who would, from now on, understand that their integrity mattered. Michael sat down beside her and took her hand. She did so much, Michael said quietly. with just one decision to stand up for what was right. "She's still doing it," Sarah replied. "She'll be doing it for years to come. Every time a young soldier chooses integrity over comfort, every time someone decides that truth matters more than career advancement, every time a person finds the strength to stand alone against corruption, that's Rebecca. That's her legacy." Sarah Chen had started her journey looking for simple answers, for someone to blame for her daughter's death. What she had found instead was something far more complex and far more meaningful. An understanding that one person's courage could ripple outward and change lives in ways that were impossible to predict or measure. Rebecca was gone. Nothing would change that. But she was also more alive than ever, in the stories told at West Point, in the soldiers who now chose integrity, in the policies changed, and the systems reformed. As Sarah looked at her daughter's name on the award plaque, she finally felt a kind of peace. Not the peace of moving on and forgetting, but the peace of knowing that her daughter's death had meant something, that it had counted for something, that Rebecca had not died in vain. The enemy had marked Rebecca Chen as KIA. But what they had not understood, what no one could have predicted, was that Rebecca's real power lay not in her life, but in her death, in the way that single act of courage would continue to inspire and change people for decades to come. Rebecca Chen was gone from this world, but in the most important way, she was still fighting. She was still winning. She was still making a difference. And as long as people like Jessica Martinez and Thomas Hart and all the young soldiers at West Point chose to honor her memory by standing up for truth and integrity, she always would be.